Welcome back to Study Hall, everybody, and happy Philosophy Friday to you all.
Yes, indeed.
You know what that means?
Time for some philosophy.
Time to put on our thinking caps and grapple with some big ideas.
That's right, those juicy, mind-bending ideas.
That make philosophy so much fun.
Yeah.
Today, we are diving deep into a concept that might just turn your whole understanding of history on its head.
Ooh, I love it already.
I'm talking about sexual repression.
Okay.
Or, more specifically, how a philosopher named Michel Foucault questioned whether it's even as widespread as we believe.
Always a good one to shake things up.
Right. The common narrative goes something like this.
Okay.
Western societies were pretty open about sex until about the 17th century.
Okay.
And then, bam, Victorian era takes over.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, it's all hush-hush about anything, even remotely related to, well...
Victorian sexuality.
Exactly.
All very buttoned up.
And the sources we dug into really paint that picture. We've got this image of Victorian sexuality confined to the home.
Yeah.
Laser focused on making babies.
Okay.
And shrouded in silence. Anything outside of producing an heir was basically taboo.
Yeah, it's like society tried to pretend certain very human urges just didn't exist.
Right.
Shoved them under the rug.
But here's where Foucault throws a wrench into that narrative.
Okay.
He argues that this whole repressive hypothesis, this idea that we've been sexually repressed for centuries, is more about how we talk about sex than actual repression itself.
So he's asking, why are we so obsessed with the idea of being repressed?
It's almost like he's saying, hey, instead of just assuming we're repressed, let's look at why we're so eager to announce a repression in the first place.
That's a good point.
And this is where things start to get really interesting.
I'm ready.
Foucault suggests that this intense focus on repression might actually be a way of exercising power.
Ooh, that's juicy.
Think about it if you control the narrative around sex. You control how people understand it.
You control how people experience it.
So it's not just about silencing people. It's about shaping their whole understanding of what sex even is.
Now, to really get Foucault, we have to understand what he calls the discursive fact.
Okay.
What that means is, by talking about something, even if we're saying we shouldn't talk about it, we're actually giving it power.
Interesting.
And creating a whole set of rules and ideas around it.
So even in trying to suppress something, we end up giving it more attention. Shaping how it's understood.
It's like a weird paradox.
It
and, you know, Foucault points out that even in the 17th century, there was still some openness about sex.
Okay.
It wasn't a black and white shift.
So it's more nuanced.
Way more nuanced.
Than just open versus repressed.
Exactly. It's about how the conversation itself changes the game.
I like that.
All right, so let's take a closer look at Victorian society, which is often held up as this ultimate example of sexual repression. You've got this image of total silence and denial around anything deemed illegitimate. But on the other hand, places like brothels and mental institutions were popping up spaces dedicated to containing and controlling those illegitimate sexualities.
So it's like they couldn't completely ignore these realities.
Nope.
So they created these carefully controlled spaces to deal with them.
Exactly, and that's what Foucault's getting at.
Okay.
He's not saying repression never happened.
Right.
He's questioning that simple, clean narrative.
It's more complex than that.
It's way more complex and twisted than we tend to think.
He's basically pulling back the curtain.
Exactly.
And saying, look, things aren't always what they seem.
Right, and that complexity is what makes this deep dive so fascinating.
I'm with you.
We're not just learning about history, but learning how to think critically about the stories we've been told.
So don't just take the common narrative at face value.
No.
Question it.
Yes.
Dig deeper. Ask yourself, why are we talking about this in this way?
Good question.
Who benefits from this particular framing?
Okay, I'm going to throw this out to you listening.
Okay.
We've been talking about Foucault's ideas here.
Yeah.
But before we go any further, take a moment to think about this.
Okay.
If the Victorians were so repressed, why were they so obsessed with talking about what they weren't supposed to be doing?
The great question.
We're going to unpack that when we come back, so hold that thought.
Yeah.
All right, so we left you with kind of a head-scratcher there.
Yeah.
If the Victorians were so repressed, why were they so obsessed with talking about all the things they supposedly shouldn't be doing?
It's a great question, and it gets right to the heart of what Foucault is trying to say.
Yeah.
He points out that this talk about repression didn't actually silence sex.
Right.
It created more opportunities to talk about it.
Exactly. And it's not just the quantity of the talk.
Okay.
It's the ways in which that talk is being shaped and controlled.
So who gets to decide what's normal and what's not?
Precisely. And this control can manifest in some pretty interesting ways.
Like?
Think about it. Foucault points out that even in the 17th century, there was still some openness about sex.
Right.
But over time, the discourse around sex became increasingly medicalized, scientific, and even confessional.
So instead of being something that was openly discussed and even celebrated in some contexts, sex became something that needed to be studied, analyzed, and regulated by experts.
Exactly. Think about the rise of fields like psychoanalysis, sexology, even demographics. All these fields popped up during the 19th and 20th centuries, and they were obsessed with understanding, categorizing, and ultimately controlling sexuality.
And that's where the power comes in, right?
Exactly. The people who get to define these categories, these norms around sexuality, they're the ones who get to say what's acceptable and what's not.
It's like the more we talked about repressing sex, the more we actually ended up talking about sex.
Yes.
But in this very carefully controlled and monitored way.
Yeah, and let's not forget about the role of religion in all of this.
Oh, it's true.
You can't talk about Victorian society and repression without bringing up the church.
Absolutely.
Think about the role of confession in Catholicism.
Yeah.
For centuries, people were required to confess their sexual sins to a priest. That's another form of this incitement to discourse.
Wow.
Even if it's framed as a means of seeking forgiveness and purification.
So in a way, the church was actually encouraging people to talk about their sexual desires and transgressions.
Yeah.
But only within this very specific controlled context.
Exactly. Yeah. And by making sex something that needs to be confessed, they were also reinforcing its power.
So it's like a double whammy.
Kind of, yeah.
It's wild. The more we try to silence something, the more it seems to find new ways to be spoken about.
It's like it can't be contained.
Even if those ways are often disguised or distorted.
And that's one of the things that makes Foucault's work so challenging.
I can see that.
He's asking us to look beyond the surface to see the subtle ways in which power operates through discourse.
Right.
Even when it looks like it's doing the opposite, repressing, silencing, denying.
It's almost like a magic trick.
Right. We're so focused on what we think is being hidden that we miss the real action happening right in front of us.
Okay, so let's bring this back to our listeners.
Yeah.
Why should they care about Foucault's critique of the repressive hypothesis?
That's a great question.
What does this have to do with their lives today?
I think one of the most important things we can take away from Foucault's work is the need to be critical of the narratives we're told.
Okay.
Especially when it comes to something as personal and powerful as sexuality.
So don't just accept the idea that we're living in a sexually repressed society.
Great. Question it. Ask yourself who benefits from this narrative.
Who benefits, yeah.
What are the power dynamics at play, and how is this narrative shaping my own understanding of sex and relationships? It's a lot to think about.
It is, but I think Foucault's work can help us to see the ways in which power operates in more subtle, insidious ways.
So it's not always about overt censorship or control.
Right. Sometimes it's about shaping the very language we use to talk about ourselves, our desires, and our experiences.
So it's not just about what we're allowed to say,
but
also about how we're encouraged to say it, and what those ways of speaking reveal about the power structures in our society.
Precisely. And that's something we can apply to so many different aspects of our lives, not just sexuality.
Right. Like what?
It's about being aware of the ways in which discourse shapes our reality.
Okay.
And then asking ourselves how we can challenge and disrupt those narratives that don't serve us.
All right, that was a lot to unpack. Before we wrap things up, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
Okay, shoot.
We've been talking about how power can operate through language, through shaping the way we talk about things.
Right.
But what about silence?
Oh, interesting. What happens when we choose not to speak?
Yeah.
Or when we're actively silenced?
That's a good question.
Can silence also be a form of power?
Hold on to that question.
Okay.
We'll dig into it in the final part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we've explored some pretty heavy ideas in this deep dive, but stick with us because this is where it all comes together.
Yeah, it's all going to make sense now.
We've been talking about Foucault's critique of the repressive hypothesis.
Right.
How our focus on being sexually repressed might actually be more about control than actual silencing. But then we throw out another question.
Yeah.
Can silence itself be a form of power?
That's such a great point to end on because it takes us right to the heart of Foucault's thinking.
Okay.
Remember, he wasn't saying there's no such thing as repression.
Right.
He was challenging us to think about how power works in much more subtle and complex ways.
So it's not just about what we're not allowed to say, but also about what we're not hearing.
Exactly.
Voices that are being excluded from the conversation.
Silence can be incredibly powerful. Think about it. Who benefits from certain voices being silenced?
Oh, that's true.
Whose interests are served when certain topics are taboo?
Yeah.
When certain experiences are pushed to the margins?
It makes you wonder if the things we're not talking about are often the things that most need to be brought into the light.
Absolutely. And this is where Foucault's work can be so valuable. He gives us tools to start questioning those silences.
Okay.
To start listening for the voices that are missing from the dominant narrative.
Well, how do we do that?
How do we start listening for those silences, those voices that are being excluded or ignored?
Yeah.
Well, I think it starts with being aware of the power dynamics at play.
Okay.
Who's controlling the conversation, whose stories are being told, and whose stories are being left out.
So it's about being critical consumers of information.
Yes.
About looking beyond the surface and asking ourselves, who's missing from this picture?
Who's missing?
Whose voices are being silenced?
Exactly. And it's also about being willing to listen to those voices even if they're uncomfortable.
Right.
Even if they challenge our assumptions.
It's like we have to actively seek out those alternative perspectives, those untold stories that might be lurking in the shadows.
Yeah. And sometimes it's about creating spaces where those voices can be heard, where those stories can be told safely and openly.
So it's not just about listening.
No.
It's also about amplifying those voices, about making sure they're part of the conversation.
Right. And remember, Foucault's ideas aren't just about sex.
Okay.
This framework can be applied to so many other areas of our lives.
Like what?
Politics, race, gender, mental health, you name it.
Wow.
Anytime we see a dominant narrative, it's worth asking whose voices are being silenced, whose stories are being left out.
So the next time you encounter a silence, don't just accept it.
No.
Question it. Dig deeper. Listen for the voices that are missing and ask yourself, why is this being silenced?
No, why?
Who benefits from this silence, and what can I do to disrupt it?
And with that, I think we've given our listeners plenty to chew on.
It's been a real deep dive today, folks.
It has.
But hopefully you've come away with a new way of thinking about power silence and the stories we tell ourselves about the world.
Absolutely.
So keep those critical thinking caps on, and remember, sometimes the most powerful things are the ones that are left unsaid.
I like that.
Until next time on Philosophy Friday, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.